Okay, let's unpack this one. We're diving into a piece of gear that's achieved this, well, almost mythical status among a very specific kind of player,
Yeah.
sound designer, the sonic explorer. We are talking about the Electro Harmonix Flanger Hoax.
And that name, Flanger Hoax, it really kind of tells you everything, doesn't it? About the philosophy behind it. It wasn't just another modulation pedal for like a quick guitar solo. The sources, they rightly call it an entire analog modulation laboratory.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to figure out why this large format thing, which popped up in the mid-2000s, got such an intense cult following. And why that name Hoax hinted it was way more than just a simple flanger.
Right.
So if you're prepping for something or just want to get why people really geek out over this specific box, the complexity, well, that wasn't a bug, it was the feature.
Definitely. And if you place it historically, the Flanger Hoax came out around, 2007? It was part of this really specific bold wave from EHX.
Yeah, I remember that era.
The era of the big boxes, right? The experimental analog monsters like the HOG, the POG, the big old holy grail reverb.
Right.
This wasn't EHX trying to make, a smaller competitor to a Boss pedal or something. The purpose was clearly, let's make a full-on sound design instrument just, in stomp box form.
That context is super important. They weren't thinking about neat pedal boards. They were thinking about sonic possibility.
Absolutely. And what's cool here is how they took a familiar effect, flanging, and just immediately flipped expectations upside down. Which brings us right to that design philosophy and the name itself.
The Hoax.
Why call it the Hoax? Well, because, it could do your classic jet plane sounds, subtle shimmer, all that metallic stuff. But the real goal, it seems, was to completely blur the lines. Flanger, phaser, chorus, even raw comb filtering. It was designed to be a modulation chameleon.
And that shape-shifting ability, that comes straight from the core design, which is where things get pretty dense. It wasn't just using one delay line with one LFO sweeping it like your standard pedal.
No, this was pure analog and kind of double-barreled, you could say. It used two separate delay lines and two completely independent low-frequency oscillators, LFOs, to drive them.
Wow, okay.
Most flangers, fundamentally, are just one bucket brigade delay chip mixed back with your dry sound, and the delay time gets swept by one LFO. Simple enough. The Hoax basically layered two whole systems like that together.
So under the hood, you've got two parallel, almost competing modulation currents going at the same time, which naturally leads to these incredibly complex, kind of asynchronous textures.
Precisely. It's not just one wave moving. It's two waves overlapping, interfering, sometimes canceling.
Wild.
Yeah. And you couldn't miss this thing on a board either. Physically, it was just enormous. That big EXO format enclosure.
The big silver ones.
Those ones. And it had this interface just covered in sliders. It really did look more like, a piece of a modular synth or a filter bank than a guitar pedal.
And it didn't just demand space on your board, right? It demanded power, too.
Oh, absolutely. To get the kind of headroom needed for those really wild, unpredictable sweeps and that deep resonance without just turning into mush instantly, it needed an 18-volt DC adapter.
Which is double what most pedals use.
Exactly. Most run on 9 volts. Why the higher voltage? Well, when you stack multiple analog modulation stages, like the Hoax does, and you start cranking things like feedback and depth, the signal can compress and distort really fast.
Right. It runs out of room.
The 18 volts gave it that necessary ceiling. It could handle those extreme peaks without washing out, without the analog tone just collapsing. It's another sign they were treating this like a serious piece of audio engineering, not just another effect.
So if that was the idea, build a modulation engine, then that control panel is where it all happens.
Yeah.
What was it about those sliders that unlocked all that depth? It looks, frankly, intimidating. Yeah. If someone just handed you this box, where would you even start?
Well, you'd probably start with the familiar bits, but you'd quickly realize there's more going on. You had the manual slider, that's pretty standard, sets the static delay time, the sort of basic pitch center of the flange.
Okay.
And then feedback. Critical resonance control, right. Takes the sweeps from a gentle whoosh to, like, screaming metallic howls. Standard flanger stuff so far.
But the real power, the reason this thing got its cult status, that comes from the LFOs, you said.
Yes. That LFO independence is what really turns it from just a pedal into a proper laboratory. You had separate modulation depth and rate sliders for each of the LFOs.
Ah, okay. So you could mix and match speeds and depths.
Totally. You could have one LFO doing this slow, wide, gentle sweep, and the second one doing a really fast, shallow tremor, and they constantly interact in these asynchronous patterns. You weren't just controlling the sound, you were controlling the internal timing of the machine itself.
That sounds like you could dial in like polyrhythms within the effect.
That's exactly the right term, sonic polyrhythms. It's something you find in modular synths, but it's pretty rare in a dedicated stomp box like this. It let you create textures that were constantly evolving, never quite repeating in the same predictable cycle.
Okay, now let's get into what I think is maybe the most unique feature, the thing that really helps understand the hoax part. Those phase invert switches, what did they do?
Ah, yes. This is where EHX really threw a wrench in the works, in a good way. When you flip that phase invert switch, you're literally reversing the polarity of the modulated signal, flipping the waveform upside down.
Okay, so what does that do to the sound?
Well, when that flipped wave gets mixed back with your original dry signal, instead of reinforcing certain frequencies, which is what normally creates the peaks of a flange or phase, they cancel each other out perfectly.
Whoa. So it's not just sweeping frequencies up, it's actively removing them, creating gaps in the sound.
Exactly that. It creates these really dramatic, dynamic cancellations. The tone doesn't just sweep through peaks. It plunges into these deep, resonant valleys. It gives the sound this hollowed out, almost spectral quality.
That sounds intense.
It is. And that's how the Flanger Hoax could do these really complex phasing and comb filter sounds that were much thinner, sharper, maybe more unsettling than typical flanging.
Yep.
It let the signal kind of turn inside out, gave you those dropout moments that experimental players just love.
And then, as if that wasn't already enough complexity for one pedal, they threw in the fixed delay line controls.
Yeah, that was kind of the final layer of the cake, or maybe the sonic soup. The fixed delay line let you dial in a bit of non-sweeping constant chorus, or maybe a doubling effect underneath all the chaos of the two main LFOs sweeping around.
So it could add some body back.
Exactly. Could add some body and girth, maybe stop the massive phase cancellations from making the overall tone just completely disappear sometimes. A bit of grounding, maybe.
Okay, so if you put all that together, the independent LFOs, the phase inversion, the fixed delay, I can see why you'd say sound designers could basically tune this thing like a synth filter bank.
Totally.
You weren't just picking flanger preset 1 or 2. You were properly engineering a sound structure from the ground up almost.
Which leads us perfectly into the actual sonic output. And like, who on earth was using this monster? It had this really interesting dual personality.
Right, yeah.
On one hand, yeah, you absolutely could dial in beautiful classic flanger sounds, that jet plane whoosh we talked about, subtle metallic shimmer. That was the flanger part of the name. Totally legit.
But the hoax part, that's where things got weird, right?
That's where it went off the rails in the best possible way. That's where you got those super wild, complex phasing textures, the extreme comb filtering, those chaotic resonant cancellations from the phase invert switches. And crucially, when you push those LFOs really fast up into audio rates, they started to actually modulate the audio signal itself. The sources mention it could produce genuine ring modulator style clangs.
Ring mod. Seriously. From a flanger.
Yeah. These metallic, dissonant, almost bell-like tones. Stuff that is miles away from what you'd ever expect a normal modulation pedal to do. That's the hoax. It pretended to be just a flanger.
So who was actually buying this thing? It clearly wasn't the guitarist looking for that clean Van Halen flanger tone.
Oh, definitely not. Its appeal was incredibly niche. Overwhelmingly, it was popular with, like, noise musicians, drone artists, ambient soundscape designers, experimental guitarists.
The explorers.
Exactly. People who treated their pedal boards more like mini modular synths or noise machines than just effect racks. They needed those evolving, unpredictable, truly analog textures that very few other devices could make, especially back then in a Stompbox format. They didn't want simplicity, they craved depth.
Which I guess brings us to its eventual fate, its legacy. Despite being this marvel of analog engineering, the flanger hoax didn't stick around forever.
No, it didn't. But it definitely continued a proud, maybe slightly unhinged tradition at EHX. It followed in the footsteps of earlier, equally radical modulation pedals. Most famously, you've got the Polyphase from '78 and the absolute legend, the Electric Mistress from '76.
Classics.
Right. And in many ways, the flanger hoax was probably the most technologically complex flanger phaser hybrid EHX ever actually put into production. A real statement piece.
But its very nature, that complexity, the huge size, the power needs that ended up being its downfall in the market, didn't it?
Pretty much, yeah. The reason it was eventually discontinued seems pretty straightforward market reality. That niche appeal, the massive enclosure that took up half your pedal board, and frankly, the steep learning curve, it just made it impractical for the vast majority of guitar players.
Yeah, I could see that.
And as EHX, like any company, adapted to what the market wanted, they naturally shifted focus towards, smaller, more practical pedals, stuff that fit on the increasingly crowded pedal boards at the time.
Makes sense commercially, but despite being kind of impractical for many, it still holds this serious cult status today, right? People hunt these things down.
Oh, absolutely. It's highly prized by collectors and sound explorers, specifically for generating those unique, evolving, properly analog textures that are hard to replicate.
And here's a really interesting point you brought up from the sources. Unlike some of those other classic EHX modulation pedals.
Right. Unlike the Electric Mistress or the Polyphase, both of which EHX has reissued multiple times in smaller nano or exo boxes.
The Flanger Hoax has never come back.
Never. It remains unique to that specific mid-2000s era of EHX's analog ambition and hasn't been shrunk down or simplified for modern boards. It's sort of frozen in time as this big, complex beast.
So if we look back at the whole life cycle of the Flanger Hoax, from its wild inception to its discontinuation, what does this whole story really tell us about EHX, and maybe about the philosophy of effects pedals in general?
Well, I think it tells us that this pedal was a very tangible commitment by EHX to keeping deep, complex analog engineering alive and kicking, even as digital was really taking over everything.
Right.
It perfectly reinforced this idea that an effects pedal could be more than just a utility. It could be a deep engineering tool, a specialized sonic instrument in its own right.
Like a synth module, but for your feet.
Exactly. EHX was willing to build this true modulation laboratory, even though they probably knew the market for that level of intense complexity was pretty small. They seemed to prioritize possibility over, easy practicality.
It really was a beautiful, chaotic outlier, wasn't it? The Flanger Hoax demanded time, it demanded study, real sonic exploration. It rewarded the player who wanted to build their sound from the absolute ground up, not just dial in something familiar.
That intense focus on analog complexity, on deep, sometimes unpredictable instrument design, that truly defined the Flanger Hoax. Maybe it was a bit ahead of its time, definitely too complex for the mainstream market, but absolutely perfect for that dedicated sonic explorer type.
And that kind of leaves us with a final, maybe provocative thought to chew on as we wrap up. If the Flanger Hoax really represented EHX's commitment back then to making pedals truly instruments, deep, complex tools that require some mastery, what does its discontinuation and the fact it's never been reissued say about what modern guitarists or maybe musicians in general prefer today? Are we, maybe as creators, sometimes sacrificing that possibility of unpredictable deep analog exploration for the convenience and the immediate gratification that simpler, more standardized, maybe more easily digestible effects provide? Something for you to ponder maybe the next time you're looking at the precious real estate available on your own pedal board.